Ladies and gentlemen, hello, welcome back to another episode of The Professor's Lab. Today we're going to talk about villains. Those bad guys, the ones you love to hate, you hate to love them, and if you do your job right, you just might love to love them. Or hate to hate them. Doesn't matter. Let's talk about villains. I have handled villains so many different ways in the past, and for anybody that is concerned about spoilers and such, I'm not going to talk about villains for the TOTS game, because obviously those are still forces that are at play. So we're going to start with how I handled villains in the first game I ever ran, because it was a little bit clunky, but it actually worked pretty well, and then we'll get to how we did it through something like Ragnarok. But the first thing I want to touch on is, obviously, everybody has their own ways of doing villains, and there's 1,000,001 incredible videos out there on how to make your villains unique. So I'm not going to harp on the classic points of the villain needs to be believable, you should agree with them, and that should make you question your own beliefs and stuff like that. Those points have been made 1,000,000 times over. So I'm going to start out with just some examples of how I've done it in the past and then how I run them today, because that has changed a lot since I started, and it might make for some interesting discussion in the comments. So the first villain that I ever ran was sort of a two-tier villain, because it's always fun to have somebody that they think is the big bad, and then they take them down and they're like, oh, you won't believe what happens next when my boss comes down. And they're like, wait, what? So I love doing stuff like that, because then it keeps everything sort of connected, and then the players don't feel sort of lost and aloof when they finally do accomplish that goal of taking out their big bad. So the way I used to run villains is I would have the villains think the party has something that they want, or want something that the party actually has. I've talked a little bit in some Twitch streams in the past about a certain cursed golden dagger and bow that I gave to my party very, very early on. They were super high level cursed items that I gave the party, and they were like 3rd level. But it was the first campaign I'd ever run. I had no idea what power balancing was, so it didn't matter. It was a lot of fun, and those weapons did a lot of crazy things, so we did a lot of mass combats back in the day, and that was a good thing to do. But I had my lovely villain who ran an organization known then and now as the Privateers, which is the only nod to the TOTS game that we'll talk about today, because I enjoyed that group and that villain so much. I like to put a little homage to him in every game that's come after. So the villain wants the dagger and the bow because he believes that if he can get those things, he can resurrect a long-lost love, because that to me at the time, it made sense. It was easy. I could remember it, and it was a good way to get started with a villain that's not just, okay, it's a bunch of goblins. So our villain wants something that the party has. It was a good trick early on to make the party work together, make them communicate. It encouraged them to use these super powerful items less, and it made it more impactful when they actually would use them, because they did have some pretty insane drawbacks. They could do anything from petrifying a random creature within 30 feet of you to, I think at one point I think the fighter got turned into a half orc from a random table. I made a lot of random tables for these weapons. It was a wacky time. But the villain had an easy trail to follow because of all of these ridiculous magic effects. He could just sort of track them down. And my villain was also an infernal warlock. So he was tracking them down because his devil patron is the one that made those cursed weapons, and told the party, hey, there's a guy coming for these weapons, don't let him get them. And he told the other guy, hey, there's a group of adventurers that don't know what they're doing, and they have these very dangerous artifacts, and if you get it back from them for me, I'll give you what you want. So now I've got a villain who thinks he's doing the right thing, and I've got a party that think they're doing the right thing. So again, it's a little, it's kind of funny when I lay it out like this now, because it's been almost like 8 years, I think, since I ran that game. So I'm like, nowadays I would do it a little more subtly than literally tell them, hey, this is a thing that's happening. But I wanted my villain to have a good reason to chase after them. And they had messed with a couple like supply caches of his a few times. They'd stolen from him. So it started out as like a little petty rivalry, and very quickly evolved into like a blood feud with them. So the party heads back to their home kingdom. They've been adventuring for a bit. They've got some money they want to spend, and they want to kind of let off some steam. So they head back home. And my villain shows up, thinks that they're in this kingdom, tries to hold the whole kingdom ransom, and to make a long story very short, he ends up pretty much destroying the entire kingdom. So now I've got a villain who has done horrible, horrible things in what he thought was a quest for redemption for himself. But at a certain point, he's given up so much of himself in this quest for revenge that now he just wants to destroy the players. So I had a villain that went from kind of sympathetic to, okay, maybe pump the brakes a little bit, to now he's just a monster. And the party is like, okay, we have to kill this guy, because why wouldn't we? He blew up an entire kingdom with like a mass disintegrate scroll. Like, we have to fix this. So they come up with a good plan. It works really well. They throw a magic circle down. They entrap him and his warlock patron. They separated the two of them, and they kill the warlock. So now I have this devil patron who has nowhere to go but up, because he's now free from one of his little pacts, and he's more than willing to make another one. So now I've got what was the driving force for their main antagonist now became a warlock patron for our fighter. So now I have a villain who basically joined the party to try to corrupt him and make him evil. So now I've got a villain that's got a couple different layers to it. Again, it's a little bit clunky because it's a new thing, me running this game called D&D. And I was like, yeah, this will be fun. So I start rewarding that player for playing a little bit more evilly. And the more evil and horrible things he does, the more powerful he gets. And the player was a power gamer. He loved getting more and more abilities. So I had a perfect villain. He could corrupt this goody two shoes knight fighter, and convinced him that yeah, I'll give you whatever you want. You just need to keep going on the mission that I was on. So that player decided they didn't want to play that knight anymore because of how things were going. They thought it would be more fun if he became a villain. So that became our next villain. And we just had this lovely string of the party chasing down this devil and all of his little warlocks that were just running around the world, and they were doing some plane shifting and just tracking people down. So that was how I did my first ever villains. It was very simple. I kept it very direct and easy to remember so that they'd be easy to run. They had believable motivations, but they were very easy to sway and take to an extreme, because I needed an opportunity for that villain to ramp up in case the party thought, oh, this guy's not that big of a deal. All right, so now that we've talked about the first villain that I ever ran, let's talk about the next game that I moved on to after that game had sort of wrapped up and concluded. I decided for the next game I was going to try something different. I didn't want one villain, right? That wasn't realistic to me anymore. We had played D&D from 1st to 5th level, and I thought that was when the game ended. So I was like, cool, you guys did it. Let's do another game. So game 2 for my original group was a mess, and I learned a lot from it. I learned a lot about world building and sort of player agency. It was a very very important game for me to fail at so that I could sort of get to where we're at today. Made a lot of choices in that game that didn't make sense, and it took a lot of the player choice out of the whole equation, and it complicated things. It really did. But I tried to do a campaign world based off of a lovely little indie game called Moon Hunters. If you guys are familiar, it was a very neat little game. It's on Steam right now. Basically, it's this whole dichotomy of like the sun and the moon, and I thought it would be really cool to have a D&D game that takes place at night, because everybody always just camps at night and nothing else happens. So we did a game where all the players had sunlight sensitivity, because I thought that would be fun, and it was not. And it was really just, it was awkward, because in the daytime, when they were meant to be sort of resting and hiding, they could still see all of the threats out in the world. So they knew not to travel in the daytime because they could see all these dangerous creatures, but they didn't want to travel at night because their past experiences had told them that traveling at night was bad. And I think I've definitely lost track, and I don't have my notes for this game anymore because it was pretty short-lived, if I'm honest. But I had a bunch of sort of high-ranking enemies, not really like major villains, but they were all given titles of the architect of this or that. So that campaign, what that was meant to be, sort of inspired the War of the Architects in my mind. And I was like, someday I'm going to run this game, and that'll probably still happen. But there were all of these different beings that were the architect of aspects of life. So there was an architect of rot, there was an architect of woe, there were architects of like good aligned things as well, but obviously we didn't deal too much with those. But that game struggled a lot because there was no major villain. There was nothing to keep the party together, and the party basically just ripped itself apart, because that happens sometimes. If the players make their characters separately and there's not a lot of consistency between alignments and stuff, you're going to end up with some evil things and some good things. I think we had 2 humans, a halfling, a mind flayer, and a dragon were my player characters for that game, because I told them they could play whatever they wanted, and a few of them took that to the extreme. And oddly enough, the dragon was the first PC to die in any of my games, so that felt rough. But that game taught me a whole awful lot, that you can't just have evil in the world and expect the players to care about it because it's evil. You need something that links them together and kind of pushes them towards the same goal. So flash forward from there, and a few of the players from that original group sort of moved away or fell out of sync, and we had a couple different DMs during that time. We get to our 3rd game, and I decided that a few of those players that had moved away, and I got this idea, full disclosure, from Matt Colville, as I get most of my ideas from, because he's the guy. He's the one with the ideas. He's the ideas guy. So I gave a few villains to the players that could no longer play with the group. And that is my new favorite way of doing things. It is so much easier and more manageable for me to give a villain to somebody who is a player from the past that can't make it to this game but still wants to play. Because while they don't get to sit around and roll dice and do things, they still get to strategize and think about the world and contribute and have some input to it. So usually I'll find players that aren't as into the combat and the rolling of the dice and are much more into the sort of RP aspect. And I'll talk a little bit about how we did Ragnarok. So for those of you that have watched Ragnarok, you'll know that our close good friend Ben was actually Kirik Rai, aka Hot Dad. So Ben got to see a little bit of that side of the screen. And it's not a play-by-play of what's going on. It was definitely a case where I would tell him, hey, do you want to get this thing, or this thing? So I would say, like, do you want some Electivires, siege beasts? Do you want some mag mortar cannons as, like, artillery? Or do you want to go expand your sort of Zoroark Null army? And every time he would go do something, that's where he would be. I'd be like, this is going to be at this location, that'll be over there, and so on and so forth. And then I would just run D&D for the players, and his goals would progress, and he would go get the things that he wanted to get, and it would make him more dangerous the next time they ran into him. But that was the general rundown that I gave for Ben to run Kirik Rai. Now, for those of you that have watched Ragnarok, you'll know there was another force that was known only as the Undead Smiley Boys, because we didn't engage with that plot hook at all. And that was another one of my buddies from the old squad. And he was running a nobleman. He was running a nobleman for me who wanted to be a very powerful necromancer. And he had tried to do this in an earlier campaign when I was not experienced enough as a DM to handle a necromancer in a predominantly good aligned party. And he wanted to be evil. And that led to a lot of conflicts, and the other players basically ousted him and said, if you don't leave, we'll kill you. So that was a bit rough. So I said, hey, you know what? Do you want some redemption? I'm in need of a good villain. So we had his arc begin. And there was an opportunity pretty early on for the party to engage with this fellow. For anybody that's watched Ragnarok, obviously the Tommy Pickles priest. If you haven't, that's going to make no sense to you. But if you have, hopefully it brought a smile to your face like it did to mine, because I don't think I've ever laughed that hard in a session of D&D. But that individual was meant to be kind of a bridge later on if they still wanted to interact with him. But they never really bit at any of the plot hooks for that fellow, so he really just moved on unimpeded and had an entire force of zombies. Which did admittedly get taken down because 5th edition is very, very, very unfriendly to minions. So they kind of just got absolutely destroyed. But we also didn't really build them up at all, so I didn't feel the need to make them any stronger. So I definitely, from that, I did learn when you do something like this, I want the villain to have a more direct goal. Because for Kirik Rai, Hot Dad, whatever you want to call him, his goal was get as many of these stones together as you can and bring about Ragnarok. And we had the many, many factions in the world as well that I'll touch on too. Because some of them are evil aligned but weren't necessarily villains. So you've got the Harvestmen that were just out there keeping the world clean after big battles, and they knew that something was coming. They knew a Ragnarok was on the horizon, and they knew that they needed to be ready for it because it was their job. Their job is to keep the fields clean after and come in and pick everything up and turn it into mulch and move on with their lives. So we've got those guys. We've got a guild of assassins that the party could have kind of engaged with. Whole bunch of stuff, but what I've learned is I really enjoy having 2 or 3 major villains that are run by other players. And those villains are not necessarily aware of the others unless they start asking around. And it's my dream for a D&D session is to be able to have somebody running that villain the entire campaign. And towards the end, when it's coming to a head, bring that player in and sit them at the table and have them roll for their villain in the final combat. Because I feel like that would be really, really fun and a nice payoff for that villain player. But logistically, it's very difficult because the people I tend to pick to run my villains usually just live out of state or have moved away. So it's not super feasible for them to like fly down for a 3-hour game of D&D, and that's totally fair. But that's the general method I use for villains. I know it's pretty vague and it's a little bit on the shorter side, but that's really it. That's all the stuff that I have to add to the myriad other videos that have inspired me and taught me how to run villains in this way. But that's how I have always done it. That's how I will continue to run them. And that's honestly, if I'm being real with you guys, that's how we're doing it in the tots. But I'm going to keep it vague from there. But we do have a couple little questions that I will kind of dive into. They're going to be nice, short, and sweet. A lot of them are just going to be some clarifications from prior videos, or so I don't have to send you guys, back in time to watch a bunch of old lab videos. I've got a quick question from Half Divine. How do you handle the random encounters? Is it something you come up with in the moment, or do you have a random D6 roll table that you use? I've talked about it a lot before. It depends. I do both. A lot of the times it's whatever makes sense, but I will, especially these days, I do sit down and come up with as many random encounters as I can and just pick the one that makes the most sense. Sometimes I will have the players roll. Sometimes something just happens to them. Just to kind of keep that moving. We've got a quick question from D-Swag about the sort of future campaign talk that's been coming up. And it's with the talk about future campaigns. It got me thinking, if you wanted to do a cross between Pokemon and D&D, so the players have powers and different objectives, would you ever run a Pokemon Mystery Dungeon style game, or run a game closer to Legends Arceus, where a large majority of the Pokemon are the monsters of the world and before the Pokeball? So definitely closer to the latter. I know I've talked about it a lot before, and I seem to be on the sort of wrong side of the fence in a lot of people's minds. I am not a huge fan of the Mystery Dungeon games. They're not really my style. I'm not a huge, dungeon crawler guy. I don't really like games like Diablo or anything like that. So those don't really mesh well for me, so that's not really the aesthetic that I'm going for. Because if the players are Pokemon, then it kind of defeats the purpose of them being able to catch and befriend others, or at the very least it shifts that dynamic in a way that's a little bit odd. But it's a phenomenal idea, but not to be super dismissive. I do genuinely appreciate the idea, but it will probably not happen in that way. We do have some pretty concrete ideas of what we want to do for game 2. It's just gonna be a question of when that starts and sort of what that looks like down the line. But we'll get into that when we get a little bit closer. And I do want to tackle something from the Discord to bring us home today. Our close good friend New Boy over in the Discord had asked how I handle the moves Stockpile, Spit Up, and Swallow. So, because those are kind of all linked together. They're odd moves even in the game, so how do you run them? How do you balance them in a D&D context? So I'm going to talk a little bit about a Gulpin and a Swallot build that I've got right now that I threw together just to have these moves. So let's talk about Gulpin. So Gulpin has access to a couple fun and interesting abilities that I'm quite a big fan of. It's got Liquid Ooze. If an opponent would gain hit points from a damaging attack or ability that triggered and targeted this Pokemon, it instead loses that amount, plus this Pokemon's proficiency bonus, if you use that sort of thing, if that's your jam. Alternatively, you have access to Sticky Hold. So the Pokemon has advantage on checks made to grapple and has advantage on saving throws against effects that would move it, as long as it is in contact with a solid surface. Pokemon may use an action to affix itself to a surface. If it does, its movement speed becomes 0 and it becomes immobile. You may end this effect as an action. Additionally, your held item cannot be removed from you against your will. So that's sort of the game mechanic, and then how would that translate into a D&D context? This is just a very sticky creature. It's very hard to move if it doesn't want to be. So we have Gluttony as the last one. Pokemon may use a bonus action on its turn to eat a berry it is holding regardless of the requirements of said berry, and the Pokemon immediately gains the effects of any berry it eats. So if there's any sort of delay on there, if there's any when someone would take damage, you can force them to eat this. Those ones get a little bit weird, but anything like that, he can eat it, and then if there's any kind of delay on the berry, it triggers right away. Because sometimes it's in 2 rounds, you'll gain some hit points and stuff like that. We've made some weird berries for the game that haven't come up yet. But Let's talk about the marquee moves. I'll tell you how I did it, and then we'll show you a couple other options in case you don't want to go this route. So Stockpile, I currently have as an action. You gain a stack of Stockpile. You gain a +1 to your AC and your saving throws for each stack, and it can stack up to 6 times. For every 2 stacks of this ability, you might throw in something like your speed decreases. That can be a good way to offset it, because I know that is the crux of sort of the issue that everybody was worried about for these moves, is how do you not just do like 1 or 2 stacks of this to get the AC boost? Like, why would you ever not do that? And I don't think that that's a problem, because it's going to take them 2 rounds to get that, and at that point, if you set up with a Stockpile in a Pokemon battle, that's a good strategy. You're going to be a lot harder to take down, so I would reward them for it. But what do you do with these Stockpile stacks, now that you have your AC and your saving throws beefed up? We have moves like Spit Up. So I have it as a base of +2 to hit, and it deals a base of 1d4 poison damage. So as an action, you spit up your Stockpile. For each Stockpile stack, you gain an additional +2 to hit and an additional die of damage. So you could use Spit Up if you have no stacks of Stockpile. It would just have a +2 to hit and deal 1d4 poison damage. But if you have all of the stacks on there, you're potentially getting up to like a +14 to hit and 7d4 poison damage. But the reason I don't see that as being particularly like overpowered or broken is it's going to take you 6 rounds of combat to get that back, because you're going to consume your Stockpile. It's going to go away. You're losing all of those AC bonuses, all of those saving throw bonuses. All of that's happening. You're doing one big hit. You're potentially one-shotting your opponent. Or you can use Swallow. So as an action, if you're still getting just absolutely wrecked and you're like your AC and your saving throw bonuses are not enough to keep you in the fight, you can consume the Stockpile, gaining 1d4 hit points for each stack that you consume. So I wrote Stockpile, Spit Up, and Swallow a lot more similarly to a like monster manual ability, where Spit Up is sort of part of the Swallow. Other way around. So Swallow is part of Spit Up's text. So it's an alternative method of consuming those stacks. So that's how I would handle those moves. I don't think it's an issue. A lot of folks are worried about something being overpowered in a vacuum. But the thing to realize is if you make it an action, that is all they're doing on their turn. They're getting a +1 to their AC, getting a +1 to their saving throws. Yes, it's going to make them harder to hit over time, but they're not going to do any damage if they just sort of sit there. And your villains, your enemies, anything else in the encounter might realize, hey, this Gulpin's AC right now is like 17 and I can't hit him. I'm just going to go hit their friends. Because there's no real like aggro mechanics. It's not like an MMO or something. You really don't have to care. You could just go attack something else. And same thing for the players. If they realize like, okay, we're never going to hit this thing, they might find another method of doing damage. But let's talk about a couple other options you might sub in. Or if you're like me and you think that Swallow and Spit Up could be the same move, just used in different ways. Classic move for Gulpin in like Ruby and Sapphire's Poison Gas. Nice little DC 10 con save. A creature within 10 feet of you must succeed that saving throw or become poisoned. And last but not least, I do love a little Gastro Acid. Same deal, DC 10 con save, but a 15-foot cone this time. All creatures in range must succeed a DC 10 Constitution saving throw or suffer 1d4 acid damage, which can't be resisted by anything so far, and have its ability suppressed for 1 minute. Because that's what Gastro Acid does in the games, and that's pretty crazy. And there's not a whole lot of abilities like that, and not a lot of Pokemon get that move, so. Gulpin's got an AC of 10, 8 hit points, 2 proficiency bonus, a strength of 10, a dexterity of 10, constitution of 14, and intelligence, wisdom, and charisma all sit at 10 as well. So Gulpin's a pretty blank slate, just a lot more hit points than you might expect from something as you level up. I've got it as size small and a 25-foot move speed. which is why I don't, rules as written, have Stockpile lowering its speed. I just have it be on a slower creature. But let's talk about Swallot for a bit here. Swallot's abilities stay the same, so still Liquid Ooze, Sticky Hold, and Gluttony. I don't change the effects between there. The Stockpile is exactly the same, and Spit Up, we just double the initial bonus to hit. We double the bonus to hit for each Stockpile damage, and we increase the damage die to 1d6. And same deal for the Swallow ability. Rather than 1d4 per stack, it's 1d6. So those abilities really just kind of grow with you. The other alternative method I came up with for Stockpile, which did kind of affect how Spit Up would play out, is you could have Stockpile at the Swallot stage, just do +2 to AC and saving throws, but you can only do it 3 times. We've talked about that before, where you would hit that cap faster, but it doesn't work as well when you have something that cares about how many stacks of Stockpile you have, so you would have to change Spit Up, in my mind, to probably have it be you gain a +8 to hit, but at that point, we're talking an impossible to miss ability after 2 buffs, so that's pretty intense. So I kept that one the same. I sort of broke the usual tradition to keep that going that way. I sub out Poison Gas for Toxic. This one just has a DC 16 con save, or you become badly poisoned. So badly poisoned, I just do XD4 damage, where X is the number of rounds you've been poisoned for. So that gets out of hand really, really quickly. Gastro Acid stays pretty much the same, but same deal. The damage die goes up a bit. We're talking 1d6 instead of 1d4, and we've got a DC 16 con save to avoid it. The AC goes to 12, HP's at a healthy 71, proficiency bonus of 4. Strength and Dexterity both go up to 15, Constitution goes to 18, Intelligence and Wisdom go to 15, and Charisma stays at 10. The speed jumps up to 30 feet, and the size becomes medium. So that is how I would handle the Stockpile, Spit Up, and Swallow abilities. The first Pokemon that came to mind that had those, so we could have a nice practical Pokemon build for the week, is Gulpin and Swallot, because I just love those guys. They're neat little Pokemon. They don't get a lot of love. They don't get a lot of attention. But that is how I would do those. Hopefully you guys found this video helpful. If nothing else, it was a little trip down memory lane for me to talk about some old villains from the past. But I'm curious how you guys would run your villains, how you've done it in your games in the past. Do you have past players run villains in current games? Do you reuse old player characters that maybe went to the dark side? But I'm curious. I'm curious how you guys would do it. I'm curious how you guys would handle Gulpin and Swallot and the sort of Stockpile conundrum. But until next time, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me in the lab. I'll see ya on Thursday for the next TOTS episode. Thank you so much, everybody.
Bye-bye.